So you beat Base Pandemic. You've gone so far as to beat the introductory, and maybe you're looking for a greater challenge beyond the standard or the legendary difficulties. This is where On the Brink comes into play. Are you looking for perhaps one disease to be stronger than the rest? Are you looking to take on an additional fifth disease in order to beat? Or are you secretly trying to capture and outmaneuver a bioterrorist? Hello everyone, Hobbyist here, back at it again with another board game tutorial, and this time we are going over Pandemic on the Brink. So, before we get into the tutorials for each of the challenges, which I'm going to break up into chapters for you guys, I first want to explain to you what all's changed with adding On the Brink to your Pandemic experience. So, this time, instead of just being able to go with 4 players, the On the Brink expansion has added a 5th action card that's exactly the same as the base game, but now enables you to play with 5 players instead of just the typical 2 to 4 that was inside of the base game. So if you want an extra player, if you want that extra thought process or that extra person with a different thinking perspective or a strategy, then you're going to want to get On the Brink to play alongside your Pandemic experience. At the same time that is going to be happening with an additional 5th player, also comes another Epidemic card. Now, it is still just a standard Epidemic card, but one thing that you're going to want to know in order to separate On the Brink from the rest of your Pandemic experience is that this logo here is the symbol for On the Brink. Most of the new cards and the new roles that exist inside of On the Brink are going to bear this logo. So if you don't want to play with On the Brink, you want to separate it from the rest of your games, just look for that logo, and it makes it easy for you as far as differentiating it from the rest. Other things that are also added is that if you ever lose an event card, or if you're wanting to come up with your own event card or your own role, or you need a spare role card, On the Brink has its own blank cards that you're able to use. So if you want to create something new, that's awesome. If you want to replace one, maybe you lost it, that's also great too. Something else that Pandemic on the Brink offers is that it now adds 8 new event cards. The rules now change inside of Pandemic on the Brink when it comes to setting up your player deck, to where now, because there's also an additional 5th player that you can add, instead of shuffling all of the base game event cards and maybe adding these to your player deck, it now states that for each player that is playing inside a Pandemic, and this is going to apply to when we do things like in the lab and state of emergency as well, but instead of adding all of the events together, you only shuffle all of the event cards together that you're using, and you draw 2 event cards for each player. So at a maximum, you're only ever going to play with 10 event cards in the game. And the rest of the events that aren't going to be used are discarded discreetly, so that way you don't know what events are going to be inside of your game. It adds that bit of mystery to where you could get good things like re-examined research, a mobile hospital, special orders, a rapid vaccine deployment, borrowed time, commercial travel ban. You can even change roles, which you couldn't do before, and you have remote treatment as well. So those are all potential things that can be added inside of base game Pandemic. One other thing that we need to do before we move on to the challenges is that with the Epidemic card that is now added to the game, there is now a new legendary mode that can be added instead of just the typical heroic mode. So now, whenever you play with On the Brink, the way that the epidemics are now formatted whenever you're creating your player decks is that instead of doing the 4, 5, 6 route, now you do your 5 as your standard, you do your 6 for your step up, and then, if you're feeling super crazy, you add 7 epidemic cards to your deck instead of the 4, 5, 6. So if you're looking for that extra challenge, for that extra boost, you think you can do it, go ahead and throw all 7 Epidemic cards inside of your player deck whenever you're formatting it. But now, as just a bit of an overview before we finally move on to the challenges, we're going to start with the Virulent Strain challenge, and I'm going to explain how all that works. Then we're going to move on to the Mutation challenge, and then we're going to do the Bioterrorist challenge. Now, I've only ever played 2 out of the 3 of them, but the Bioterrorist is easily one of the more complicated sides of On the Brink, and adds a bit of hidden movement that hadn't been previously seen. So let's go ahead and move on into Virulent Strain. One more cool thing that I pretty much forgot to mention is that with On the Brink, you now have these new petri dishes that you can set up your disease cubes in. And they have these little stickers that come on them, so that way you can add it and mark it as blue disease. It even has like a space to where if you want to name your diseases, that's something else that's pretty cool. But as far as your setup, as we're going into Virulent Strain, you can put all your diseases inside of the petri dishes, and then setup for Pandemic remains exactly the same, except for one exception. The exception is these green Epidemic cards that you have, you're going to throw out. Instead of having those Epidemic cards, you're going to use these nasty red Virulent Strain cards. So these Epidemic cards work exactly the same as the green ones, but there's a key difference between the two. Following the same exact steps as the regular green Epidemic cards, you're going to still do the increase, the infect, and the intensify steps of each card that comes out, but there's also this additional bonus effect that happens at the bottom. So the biggest thing when it comes to On the Brink and its Virulent Strain cards is that this continuing effect means that it's going to last the rest of the game. The way that it works is that once all your cubes have been set up and organized, is that these Virulent Strain cards, the first one that comes out is going to help you determine which disease for the rest of the game is going to be the Virulent Strain, aka the hardest disease of the 4 that is going to be more difficult to take out. So the way that it works is that you play your game as normal, and the first Epidemic card of these that you pull is going to be helping you determine, by looking at the board, what disease has the most on the board. So you're going to check the red, you're going to check the yellow, you're going to check the black, you're going to check the blue, and see which cube at the time of that first Epidemic is going to be the most populated onto that particular area. And then, whichever one has the most population is going to be the Virulent Strain. So this one's particular ability, Government Interference, is to leave a city with a Virulent Strain disease cube. The player must first, on that turn, treat at least one Virulent Strain cube in that city before they go, because it's considered too dangerous to just leave. So because you are forced to treat a cube, it's going to cost you an action. You're only going to have 3 actions left, thus making it more challenging. And whenever these Virulent Strain cards have a continuing effect or anything like that, you're going to place them right beside the petri dishes of whichever one's the Virulent Strain, just as a sort of reminder into which one's the Virulent Strain. So that way, it might prioritize that you have to get rid of the Virulent Strain first, because these continuing effect cards of the Virulent Strains can stack on top of each other. So where a chronic effect might happen, where diseases might spread more, or it might cause you to draw more cards, or there's even a Virulent Strain card to where if you eradicate a disease, this hidden pocket will flip that eradicated disease back to just treated, and thus that disease will now return to the board and might cause even more problems. So, when it comes to Virulent Strain and the way that it sets up, any unused Virulent Strain cards, whether you do the 5, 6, or 7 option of these cards, you are going to put the rest back into the box, and you're not going to see what they are, because the Virulent Strain cards with the different abilities may or may not provide certain disadvantages. So that is something to keep in mind. But other than that, that is the primary thing that happens inside of Virulent Strain. It makes the diseases harder. So if you want to tackle that, I want to now get into the roles that may or not be able to help you inside of On the Brink. And I'm only going to ever do this for the expansions because these exclusive characters are honestly really cool. The 6 new roles that are added to On the Brink, we first have the Generalist, which is going to be the Grey Pawn, inside of the On the Brink box. Now, it's generally, I'm not a fan of her color, primarily because of the fact that if you have the Researcher in the game, it's a little confusing to tell between the 2 pawns, but the Generalist has the ability to do up to 5 actions each turn instead of the typical 4 that everybody else has. So she's honestly a really cool character to have. Shooter is the next role that is inside of On the Brink, and she has the ability to start her turn by looking at as many infection cards as the current infection rate. This can help you predict what areas are going to pop off. Inside of the Virulent Strain in particular, it might be able to tell you, okay, these Virulent Strain cities might get hit next, so it might be more important to go to those cities to do what you can to prevent them. The next ability that she has is that when you do direct flight, reveal the city card used, but do not discard it. In an experienced player's game, especially inside of On the Brink, you're going to keep the cards to yourself, the city cards that you have, instead of playing face up. You're still working on the same team, and you're still working to coordinate, but you're simply going to state which city cards that you have and where you guys can meet up and all that sort of thing. So that's why this reveal is important. Specialist has the ability to where when you enter a city with 2 or more disease cubes of the same color, remove one of them. This might be helpful for certain virulent strains or something of that nature, and definitely helps with containing it, like his card operative, which is the bright yellow pawn, is once per turn, as an action, you may move 1 disease cube from the city you are in onto this roll card. When you discover a cure, you may replace 2 of the needed city cards with 3 cubes of the cure color from this card. So, being able to replace cards with cubes, especially if you're having a hard time getting cards, or if a Virulent Strain and Chaos is happening to where there's disease cubes everywhere, he's really good at helping you do cures instead. So, he's definitely a character that I would add. Archivist, however, is really nice, because his hand limit is 8 cards instead of the 7 that most players are permitted, and once per turn as an action, you may take the city card that matches the city that you are in from the player discard pile and put it into your hand. So being able to retrieve those cards and being able to use them over and over and over again is really nice, because it might help you with certain cures if you're struggling to transport across the map and get the cards that you need, and the fact that you can hold 8 cards can make a difference in what it is that you're trying to do. Playable role inside of On the Brink is the Epidemiologist, because once during your turn, you may, with permission, take any city card from a player in the same city with you. Doing this is not an action. So basically, you have the ability to take cards, not share knowledge, and because it doesn't count as an action, it might allow you to make those extra movements and to cure the diseases, especially if it's the Virulent Strain. Altogether, Virulent Strain is the great first step when it comes to playing with Pandemic On the Brink, as it gives you enough of an introductory first start to where you know the basics as far as, like, you know how epidemic cards and stuff like that work, but there are a couple of fine points that I want to make sure that you guys are aware of. So, when it comes to the Virulent Strain challenge and these fine points, the challenge is won or lost normally. So, if you hit 8 outbreaks, you lose. If any one of the disease cubes runs out, you lose. If you run out of cards and time runs out, you still lose. So, when it comes to the complex molecular structure Virulent Strain card, that card says that it would simply mean that you would need to add another card in order to turn in order to get those disease cubes. So a player would need to turn in 6 cards of the Virulent Strain color to cure the Virulent Strain disease. However, abilities like the Scientist, who would normally have 4 cards, would then only need the typical 5 cards, or the Field Operatives, who could turn in 4 cards and replace two cubes to make up the rest, would only need 4 cards and 3 Virulent Strain samples in order to do so. So that is something to keep in mind for your guys' strategy's sake. For the Government Interference card, it says that removing but not treating a Virulent Strain disease cube with a Containment Specialist power, Field Operative sample power, or the event's remote treatment or rapid vaccine deployment does not satisfy this effect's requirement. The Event Mobile Hospital does satisfy it. Other players' pawns affected by this effect cannot be moved by the dispatcher or the event's airlift or special order unless the current player first treats a cube in the same city that the pawn is being moved in. So, it's essentially saying that there are certain characters who can and can't work around the government interference as far as restricting movement or having to treat a disease before you move, and things of that nature. So for the last one, before we move on to the other challenges inside of On the Brink, is Raid Effect, which is a Virulent Strain card. If the troubleshooter sees a Virulent Strain City card when looking at the infection cards while Raid Effect is in effect, the troubleshooter does not look at an additional card. When combining this challenge with the Mutation challenge, which we'll explain next, if the card drawn to resolve a Mutation card is a Virulent Strain City, that card does not count towards a Raid Effect. So, it's just a couple of fine points. It might seem a little bit complicated and confusing right now. I'll leave a link to the rules for each of the individual challenges if you guys have any additional questions. But that's just a couple of specifics and fine points when it comes to the Virulent Strain challenge inside of On the Brink Pandemic. So Pandemic's On the Brink Mutation challenge is the next challenge that we're going to be talking about inside of this video. So when it comes to the Mutation challenge simply adds a 5th purple disease to the game that appears in unpredictable ways. So the way that it works, as far as the objective, is that it's mostly the same as far as how you win, but it has to be one of 2 ways. It either has to be players must either cure all 5 diseases, meaning the purple mutation, the yellow, the red, the blue, and the black, or cure the 4 other diseases and have no purple disease cubes on the board. So you don't necessarily have to cure purple, but if you want to cure purple just to add that additional challenge, you're more than welcome to. But eradicating purple off the board as well also is a way that helps. So there are a couple of things that I need to go in a little bit deeper detail because this 5th disease adds a bit of complication when it comes to setting up the Mutation challenge in comparison to just throwing the Virulent Strain epidemic cards inside of your Pandemic game. Inside of the Infection deck discard pile, you are going to place these 2 Mutation cards into the discard pile. Now, the Mutation cards do not count as infection cards whenever infection cards are pulled, just as a heads up. So, whenever you are infecting cities and a Mutation card comes up with those effects, they do not count as infection cards, so you have to keep drawing. So even on 2 cards, if it's a city, then a Mutation card, then you still have to draw that 3rd card in order to make up that 2nd card, if that makes any sense. Next thing that you have to do is that when it comes to the player deck, regardless on whether you are using the typical green epidemic cards, or if you're combining the red Virulent Strain cards together, the mutation events that exist that often make it a little bit more difficult, add more purple cubes, are going to be shuffled into each of the 5 respective piles, or 6 or 7, depending on what you play with, and are all going to be shuffled together. And kind of work just like the epidemic cards when it comes to that side of the setup. Another thing that you're going to notice is that you're going to have a purple cure indicator. So whenever you cure purple, it works exactly the same to where you cover it up if you cured it, and you can flip it over if you have eradicated it. The way that On the Brink has it, and the way that I've kind of simply set up my setup in comparison, is that generally the mutation card is either going to be a physical card that you add towards the bottom here, kind of line it up, or it's going to be a physical sticker that you can attach to the board. The only reason I wouldn't recommend having the sticker put on there is that it's going to be different if you're choosing between the mutation challenge in On the Brink, or if you choose to do the Superbug challenge in State of Emergency. But we don't have to really worry about that right now, so that's the end of that. The key things that you should know about the mutation challenge in comparison to everything else is that there are far fewer purple cubes that exist in comparison to the yellow, the black, the red, and the blue. There are only 12. So whenever it comes to the 3 ways of losing, if you run out of all 12 cubes, then that is the way to lose the game. But one of the important things that I have to explain now is that the mutation, aka the purple disease, is like the other 4 cubes as far as how it operates and how it can be cured. However, it only comes in 3 different ways, and I'm going to get into greater detail on these. As mentioned earlier, the mutation cards are the first way that purple cubes can be added. So, as we're reading the card here, if a purple disease is not eradicated, draw a card from the bottom of the infection deck. Place 1 purple disease cube only on this city, instead of adding any reds or blacks or whatever color that it may be. Discard the card drawn in this card to the infection discard pile. If the purple disease is eradicated, just discard this card. In both cases, this counts as 1 infection card draw. So, retracting my previous statement, as I seem to have made a mistake in that regard, this does count as an infection card whenever it is drawn. It's just simply going to add purple cubes, which can be treated just like any other cubes in the game. So, that is the first way that the mutation can come. As I mentioned earlier, mutation event cards are the second way that purple cubes can be drawn. So, it'll have things like place 1 purple disease cube on each city with exactly 2 purple cubes. So, it could do it like that. It could, if a purple disease is not eradicated, draw 3 cards from the bottom of the infection deck. Place 1 purple disease cube only on each of these cities. Discard these cards to the infection discard pile. And then, the other one, if the purple disease is not eradicated, draw an infection card from the bottom, and then place 3 disease cubes, the purples only, on this city, and discard that card to the infection discard pile. So, these can definitely make it to where more purple cubes show up. And like I said, there are only 12 inside of mutation petri dish. So you got to be careful with how many of these you let spawn. The final way that purple disease cubes can spawn onto the board is if there was already a purple cube that existed inside of a particular city, if that infection card gets drawn again, whenever you infect that city, you have to infect it with both its cube color, so you add a yellow, and you have to add a mutation to that city as well. As I mentioned inside of my base game tutorial for Pandemic, whenever there is more than 1 color that is converging on a particular space, that does not equate to an outbreak. So right now these 4 cubes do not equate to an outbreak of either 1 color. It only accumulates to an outbreak if it's more than 3 yellow cubes, or if it's more than 3 purple cubes, in which case it would either be a purple outbreak or a yellow outbreak. If a player draws both a mutation event card and an epidemic card, you have to do the mutation event card first. Then you can do the epidemic card. Lastly, but most certainly not least, as it'll be the most important towards the mutation challenge, is that the way that you cure the purple disease is that when you are discovering a cure for the purple disease, you discard 5 city cards in any mix of colors, with at least one of them a city that has 1 or more purple cubes in it. So, if you have Kinshasa inside of your hand because it has a purple, and you have any other cards, you can go to a research station and automatically cure it, which is nice. So any characters, of course, that have the ability to turn in fewer cards, like the scientist with 4, or the field operative, at least one of those cards that they turn in has to be one with a purple cube in them. Just as a sort of clarification for you guys. If the purple disease is eradicated and a mutation card is drawn during infections, just discard it. It still counts as one infection card draw for the turn. That makes it really nice, as it might be able to break up the pacing a little bit in between draws of the infection cards. However, because there are only 2 mutation cards in the entire infection deck, this may seem like a problem, because it's more than likely that you're going to pull up more cities rather than any of those mutation cards. But they're helpful buffers regardless. So this essentially covers the mutation challenge. It just simply adds another disease. And honestly, if I'm comparing the two, if it's Virulent Strain or Mutation, I honestly like Virulent Strain more, because I like being familiar with my original diseases, but also just having one of them be stronger than another adds a little bit of a puzzle for your team to solve as well. So a 5th disease could be more challenging. I mean, it may or may not be possible, very unlikely, that the mutation could be the Virulent Strain, but like I said, it's not very likely. But now, for the most difficult as far as complexity level of the challenges inside of On the Brink, we are now going to move on to the Bioterrorist Challenge. Now, we are on to the final challenge that exists inside of Pandemic on the Brink, the Bioterrorist Challenge. The way that the Bioterrorist Challenge functions is that one player will be pitted against the rest of the pandemic research team. This challenge works with 3 or 4 players at the best. 5 players is not really recommended, as it generally makes it harder and less enjoyable for the bioterrorists to be playing inside of that capacity, because it's way easier for players to just walk around everywhere and kind of just lollygagging, oh, look, we found the bioterrorist. And that just kind of sucks. So, before we get into further explanations of the bioterrorist, I want to explain how the bioterrorist wins if you manage to beat him. And that simply is, the bioterrorist wins if the other players lose and there is at least 1 purple disease cube on the board. To win, the other players must either cure all 5 diseases or cure the 4 standard diseases and have no purple disease cubes on the board. Just as a heads up, the Bioterrorist Challenge may be combined with the Virulent Strain Challenge, but it cannot be combined with the Mutation Challenge, because the Mutation Challenge uses the purple cubes, and the Bioterrorist will also use purple cubes. So those two are not compatible with each other. You have to choose either one or the other. If you manage to get picked to become the Bioterrorist, then you are simply given the Black Pawn, the roll card, and you are given this giant pad of paper to work with. And of course, you are also going to want a pencil as well, because you're going to be writing stuff down. After the 9 cities infection step is completed inside of the Bioterrorist Challenge, the Bioterrorist is going to receive 2 infection cards from the deck, because he is, unlike the remaining players, the Bioterrorist is going to be using his infection deck in order to perform his actions and to perform his abilities, whereas the remaining players are going to be performing from the player deck. Once the first non-terrorist player has been determined, play is going to resort as normal. So players are going to do their 4 actions, they're going to draw their 2 player deck cards, resolve any epidemics if they have any, discard down to 7 cards if they're above their hand limits, and then they're going to infect cities. At the end of that infect city step it will then be the bioterrorist's turn, in which the bioterrorist can take up to 2 actions, plus 1 drive or fairy action, in any order that he sees fit. The bioterrorist does not automatically draw cards nor infect cities. He must use actions to do so. The bioterrorist uses infection cards and not player cards during play, discarding them to the infection discard pile. What cards you choose to get rid of as the bioterrorist player might also play into effect as far as if any of the regular human players draw any epidemic cards. So you want to be careful as far as, okay, you want to put these back. Maybe during the intensify step, that card will come up again, and then more of the bioterrorist purple cubes will then start to show up. The entire time that you are playing as the bioterrorist, your pawn is never going to be on the board. This is where the hidden movement games are going to start coming into play, because you're going to have a map of the entire world up top, and then all of your actions that you're going to be taking after each player's turn is going to go inside of the boxes here for each round. At the bottom, it's going to have actions as far as what notations you would use or anything like that, any results that you would have, hidden actions if you were captured, so on and so forth, just as a sort of reminder and to kind of give you guys a bit of an overview. So, the way that it works, of course, like I mentioned earlier, he is not going to be on the board physically. He's going to just sit on the card, and nobody's going to know where he is. If another player moves into a spot where the bioterrorist is, then the bioterrorist is spotted, and you would place your pawn on the board if he happened to be spotted in that location. If the bioterrorist decided that he wanted to make either a direct flight or a chartered flight to a specific location, the direct and chartered flight rules still apply the same as human players, but the only exception being that the bioterrorist is using infection cards rather than the player deck cards. The other thing to remember is that if you are the bioterrorist, and let's say we wanted to take a direct flight to Algiers, we take our direct flight to Algiers, and then the bioterrorist has to say that he was spotted at the airport in Sao Paulo. The reason that you don't mention where the bioterrorist is flying to is because even though he was spotted in Sao Paulo, it may give a hint of an idea, but it's not going to completely give away the bioterrorist. So whenever a direct flight or a chartered flight, which makes it 50-50 for the players to guess what the bioterrorist did, occurs, then you would simply say that the bioterrorist was spotted in the location he flew from, not where he's going to. So altogether, the bioterrorist, whenever he takes his turn, as I mentioned earlier, has only up to 2 actions plus 1 drive or fairy action. This optional drive fairy action may be done before, after, or between his other 2 actions. And remember, the actions that you are taking, you're not going to have the bioterrorist's physical pawn on the board. You are going to be writing on your location sheet, based on the notations given, what it is that you did on that turn. So you are keeping track of where you are. So the bioterrorist can either draw a card from the infection deck and put it into his hand, upon which the bioterrorist only has a hand limit of 7 cards, just like most human players. He can do the direct charter flight, which he has to announce where he came from, not where he's going to. He can then do his local and hidden actions. If the bioterrorist isn't spotted or captured, he can infect locally by placing a purple cube on the current city that he is in. He can infect locally by discarding an infection card to place a purple cube only in that city, but he also has the ability to infect remotely the city that he is in. So you could definitely place cubes in random locations and kind of throw off the other players. The other thing that he can do secretly is that he can sabotage. So if the bioterrorist is nearby, he can remove a research station in the city he is in discarding an infection card whose color matches the city, returning the research station to the supply. This definitely makes things harder for the other team if you're removing research stations, and thus making it harder to travel, harder to get cures, things of that nature. You're trying to do as much sabotage as possible as you can as the bioterrorist. So the way that capturing the bioterrorist works is that if the bioterrorist pawn is on the board, a player in the same city as the bioterrorist for an action may capture him. The way that capturing the bioterrorist works is that they take the bioterrorist off the board and then they put him on their roll card. When you do so, the bioterrorist loses all the infection cards that he had in his hand and he puts them in a discard pile, and they have no effect whenever they go there. If the bioterrorist is captured, then he can only do 2 actions out of the actions set that he is given. He can either draw a card or he can escape. The only way that he can escape is that he has to discard the infection card to move to its city and then announce an airport sighting there to take back the bioterrorist pawn. So essentially, you have to make a direct or chartered flight in order to escape capture, and thus have to announce yourself and honor that by any means necessary. As far as for the non-terrorist players, when it comes to curing the purple disease that the bioterrorist is spreading, it's the exact same requirements as the mutation challenge. So it's got to be a city card with a purple cube in it, and then any other mixture of cards is what are allowed to be used. Of course, with character ability exceptions that applied earlier on in this video. One of the important differences when it comes to outbreaking the purple cubes for the bioterrorist is that the outbreak still works the same in regards to the fact that each city that is connected to the city of where the outbreak took place occurs. However, the bioterrorist purple outbreaks are so intense that they take themselves out, meaning that whenever that 3 clusters hit again, you have to remove 2 cubes and put them back in the supply each time that this occurs. And remember, the non-terrorist players win if they cure all 5 diseases or cure the 4 standard diseases and have no purple disease cubes on the board. The bioterrorist wins if the players lose and there is at least 1 purple cube on the board. The bioterrorist loses and is out of the game if the players ever eradicate the purple disease. Everyone loses if the players lose and there is no purple disease cubes on the board. The only other thing that is left for the bioterrorist challenge is that there is a certain honor system that the bioterrorist has to follow. Bioterrorists may listen to other players as they discuss their plans and cards, but should not interrupt them on their turns. The non-terrorist players may not hold private discussions nor pass notes to each other. Bioterrorist may not reveal infection cards in his hand until playing them, but must disclose when asked how many cards are in his hand. Bioterrorist is on the honor system for recording his own location and reporting whenever he is spotted. So, those are the queue etiquette things as far as like making sure that the game stays fun. And I know that this has been a lot of information, especially for the bioterrorist, as he's is the most complicated for as far as his own role goes. So maybe the bioterrorist may not be interesting to you guys. So overall, what do I think of On the Brink? I think that On the Brink is the best starter kit when it comes to trying to expand your pandemic experience, primarily through the Virulent Strain and Mutation challenges, as those are just enough steps up if you're looking for something different. But to me, the Bioterrorist challenge doesn't feel a whole lot like Pandemic at all. It changes it to a whole hidden movement strategy game that I don't know if I'm too big of a fan on, if I'm being completely honest. But otherwise, if you've watched all the way through these videos, thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for making it through. Hope you can hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you guys in the next video.